Episode number 11 of the Onside CFL Fantasy Football Podcast. Lower your weapons by Revolution Engine, bringing us in, as always, each and every week, the band of engineer Ben Bussey. You can like their Facebook page, as well as you can like ours. You know what? We're also available on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and YouTube. You can subscribe to our weekly DFS rankings by visiting our website, onsidecfl.wordpress.com. Guess what? Producer Dan, engineer Ben, both nowhere to be found this week, both on vacation, so it's the Dave and Dan the Stats Guys show. Hey, why not? We'll take this whole thing over. We both went to live football games on the weekend, and let me tell you, that game in Saskatchewan, Dan was not disappointed by it.
Well, they talk in the stadium at Mosaic Stadium there about quote-unquote the Mosaic moments, and they encourage people to tell stories over the years of different games they've been at, and I guarantee that many of the Rider fans in attendance at that game, that'll be one of their longest memories they'll have of that stadium. Obviously, the big play, the minute to go, Tyler Capina kicks the game-winning field goal. The Riders win it 30-29. Obviously, a lot of people would say it may not have been in that position had it not been the injury to Trevor Harris, but for many people, it's just about the memories, and they got memories that game, just like many at Commonwealth Stadium. The next night, the game that you were at, where Jeremiah Masoli set a CFL record for completions.
Yeah, I can't really call it a Mosaic moment, but it's something that'll be etched in the memories of Eskimos fans for years to come, and be it Ticats fans as well. There were plenty of them on hand to witness Masoli's 23 straight completions. Whose record did he break? None other than the guy he was looking straight across at from the field, Jason Moss. Did that a number of years ago against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Down 31-6 at halftime, straight back to win 37-31. And don't look now, but the Hamilton Tiger Cats are making a statement in the CFL. And I guess he only was able to have that because of the injury to Zach Collaros. Much like you said, Mitchell Gale, the injury to Darian Durant. So injuries were the theme of the weekend. There were a whole lot of them. We may as well get right to it. And I guess the two injuries we should talk about are producer Dan and engineer Ben. They're both in here in spirit. And I know there's going to be a number of requests from producer Dan's acting skills. Dan the Stats Guy, is there any way you and I can recreate the voice of producer Dan?
I don't think so. I don't know if I have the ability to do the accent, but we appreciate their efforts and thank them for everything that they do for us every week. And obviously another busy week as a game on Monday has us kick this podcast back an extra day. Obviously, the other one being our CFL DFS rankings came out a little bit later, and those came out on Tuesday. If you haven't got those already, $20 Canadian. So if you're an American listener, we've said it before. It's basically like we're paying you to purchase our rankings on there, and you'll get them for the full season. Just to kind of give you some background, game-by-game stats for the full season of the two teams that are playing, and obviously the 4 games for the week, position-by-position rankings, and then we do a couple of features. Sure looks hot and sure looks cold. Gives you an ability to give us, I guess, an ability to justify why guys are high or low in our rankings and why you should fade certain guys in the cold rankings. And this week's no exception. We'll get to some of them in our matchups and really talk about why some guys really need to be targeted this week.
Yeah, we got a lot to get through. We have a huge social media segment, as well as if you're playing long format. I know we have quite a few listeners who play long format, tons who have DFS. Thank you so much, by the way, for the downloads and the listens. Numbers are through the roof. We're going to get through some injuries here and some of them on defense. If you're in long format, I know personally, my long format league last week took a bit of a hit there because I had Trevor Harris in my starting quarterback, and I know Dan's long format team is looking pretty good right now as well, and definitely are big supporters of long format football on the Onside Fantasy Football Podcast. And Dan and I have been playing long format for a number of years, have we not?
Yeah, and obviously some questions come through about stats things and that sort of thing. The website Fantasy, we are separate from them, so direct your questions from them. It seems like more questions coming through this year of things that they're missing, so really push them to get on it and actually follow through on what they're supposed to do. Absolutely. If there's something that we definitely appreciate is being able to stand up and say, hey, we back up
what you're talking about. And with that being said, the Bombers were backed up against the wall last week. All the injuries that they had pile up with their secondary, not to mention, well, their secondary was pretty much where they got hit, and one of the reasons why the Stamps were able to knock them down. So as we're heading into Thursday's game, let's take a quick look at some of the injuries that'll be in that matchup. We'll get to matchups later on in the show, but the first game we'll get to is Winnipeg-Edmonton, the injuries. Quincy McDuffie missed practice on Monday, likely still not going to be back in action. He's been gone for a couple of weeks. Kevin Fogg is going to be returning kicks. Mo Leggett saw a bit of duty there as well, but Kevin Fogg likely is going to get in the bulk of that. Patty Neufeld placed on the 6th game in the offensive line. Not much of a difference if you're a long format or if you're a DFS player, but the big thing there is quarterback hits as well as opening holes up for the running backs.
Yeah, and with the rest of the offensive line there was the injury to Neufeld. He gets put on the 6th game. Jamarcus Hardrick, another member of the offensive line, was banged up in that game. And then a third one as well goes down with injury. Suki Chung, the Canadian offensive lineman, but it looks like the latter two will play. Neufeld obviously being out, but with a banged up offensive line, that could mean some trouble for Andrew Harris in the running game.
3 big defensive backs went down. Chris Randall looks like he's going to be gone for about 3 weeks. Terrence Frederick will make his debut at field corner for the Bombers. And longtime Winnipeg fans and even CFL fans have been pretty observant, and we mentioned on the podcast before that at times Chris Randall was the only guy holding the secondary together in Winnipeg. It seemed like he's going to be gone for a few weeks as Macho Harris, the favorite whipping boy over the past couple of years, if you're a Saskatchewan fan, and started to pull it together a little bit this year. He did get beat quite often, but he's able to make a few plays. He left the game on Thursday, placed on the 6th game. We saw Brendan Morgan come in his favor, and Julian Posey rounding out those 3. Going to be gone for a couple of weeks, but good news, Winnipeg fans. You've been waiting forever. Bruce Johnson's back off the 6th game. He's going to be back at halfback.
Yeah, that's the big one for the Bombers, and we'll get, obviously, like we say, we'll get to it in the matchups, but might as well jump right in with this. Bruce Johnson will be on a Darius Bowman this week. That's the one that for sure the Winnipeg Blue Bombers are going to make sure that they have, is Bruce Johnson on a Darius Bowman, and it's good for them. He comes off the 6th game with the hand injury, and I guess at least a little bit shores up that defensive secondary.
J.C. Sherritt is the lone injury for the Eskimos that at times have seen themselves in infirmary, but he left the game on Saturday, did return Donnie Beggs. If you read our blog this morning, no relation to Stevie Shakespeare. Beggs came in, but Sherritt did return to that as well. And longtime CFL fans, any CFL fan, I should say, a guy like J.C. Sherritt who plays the game at such a high level, it only does the game service to have him 100% healthy. He is one of the most exciting players to watch on the defensive side of the ball.
You know, that could be one of the big factors of contributing to Hamilton making that comeback late in the game on Saturday. Sherritt obviously is the signal caller in the middle of the defense, and if he goes out with an injury, suddenly there's a rookie in there and Donnie Beggs calling the plays in from the sideline. And you know, sometimes a guy like Sherritt, he's a veteran in the league. He's been in the league for, it seems like, about 4 or 5 years. In the middle of that Edmonton defense, that can make a big factor, losing a veteran presence like that.
Moving on to Friday night, Saskatchewan and Montreal. Darren, as we're not obviously getting into matchups yet, just the way we have it written out here, and I'm the kind of guy who likes to say things out loud. So here we go. Darren Durant, sprained ankle. He did miss week 5 and participated in a Monday walkthrough, though. However, Rider fans aren't worried, right? Mitchell Gale throwing for almost 400 yards last week, but will we see Darian play this week? There's still a possibility, is there not?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion on different CFL forums of whether Durant will be back or not, and I think the key thing to look at with this, as far as Durant, I think Chris Jones watched that Montreal-Toronto game very closely, and you see Kevin Glenn go down, you see Montreal in a little bit of a disarray on Monday. They didn't look very good on defense. And I think had it been any other opponent, save for maybe the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, Darian Durant probably would be back in. I'd like to think just with the way things are going in Montreal, they'll rest Durant for another week. And then it's back-to-back weeks for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, a home-and-home with the Calgary Stampeders. And those are big games, big division games. And I think they'll allow the veteran to come back for that one. But if you're asking me right now, I would say that Mitchell Gale will be under center on Friday.
Can't go wrong with that. Mitchell Gale, as I mentioned, put up almost 400 yards in offense, and many were surprised by his abilities, and many not. Curtis Steele is a guy that I've been surprised hasn't really turned it on at all this year, and he had his chances early, but I love to see a big game out of this guy this week. He did leave the game on Friday. He was in street clothes, but did return to practice on Monday, and there's a small chance Michael Dyer might be able to get in there, and obviously if you're a DFS player, Michael Dyer wouldn't be in the system. Matt Walter more likely to get a lot of the looks, and I personally would love to see Curtis Steele. I know he's got the potential. I'd love to see a big game out of that guy potentially this weekend if he's able to break free. Could be the one, but hopefully he's okay after a leg injury.
Yeah, and obviously for him, a decent enough start in week 2 for the Rough Riders, their opening game of the season against the Toronto Argonauts. He was the most targeted player on the field in that game, but since then hasn't really been used as much in the Rough Riders offense. It should be interesting, especially considering that Mitchell Gale is a younger quarterback, whether or not they will use him. If he is in the lineup, I would like to think that they'd use him pretty heavily, especially if they are able to build up a lead on the Montreal Alouettes in that game on Friday, but obviously all depends on Steele's health.
Dare we say this next guy might be someone you should start to be a little cautious with. John Childs, a late scratch for that game last weekend. The Riders put out another depth chart hours before the game. Doesn't happen very often without John Childs. Ryan Langford did come in. He looked really good in the replacement of the big target. And unfortunately, as we mentioned, even in our fantasy football guide, the one we put out at the start of the season, Childs is a guy that could lead the CFL in receiving yards if he wanted to. He just can't get by that injury bug.
Absolutely, and it looked like it was going to be a pretty serious knee injury when it happened in that BC game. Was sort of a question mark all week, and like you said, was a late scratch. Ryan Langford came in, and you know what? The thing is, I really like the way Ryan Langford works. I think that he also could be a guy, and I know it's someone that you've had a little bit of a soapbox on, is Kendall Lawrence, and I could see Ryan Langford, as far as the return game goes, if Chris Jones isn't happy with the performance of Kendall Lawrence, suddenly Ryan Langford could kind of quickly become a bit more of a factor as we shift into the strong side receiving position, where Shamot Chambers also missed the game with a hamstring injury. He did return to practice, so Nick Dembski will be involved back in the return game a little bit more. Lawrence obviously had that missed field goal return that went for nothing because of 2 illegal blocks on the play, but that's going to be something I think it's going to be interesting. I would have to think that the Rough Riders brass were happy with the performance of Langford last Friday, and they're going to be kind of watching him. He could really become somewhat of a dark horse as the season goes on.
And we know Chris Jones, if he doesn't like you, he'll quickly exit you. But Kendall Lawrence almost seems like it's his long-lost son, or his son from a different mother. He's loved Kendall Lawrence for quite a long time. A pair of offensive lineman injuries here will quickly fire through. Obviously, for the fantasy football format, you can't pick up an offensive lineman. Brandon Labatt and Dan Clark. Those are 2 big injuries, though. Clark did participate in the walkthrough on Monday, so there could be a chance he could play this weekend.
Yeah, and he actually did leave the walkthrough, and also Xavier Fulton did leave the walkthrough. Some injuries on the Riders' offensive line, that could be a factor. So watch for the depth chart when that comes out on Thursday as far as the health of the offensive line in Saskatchewan.
And on the defensive line, a bookend, a guy converted from receiver last year, turned some heads early on for his prowess and how he just attacked the football. AC Leonard left the game on Friday. John Newsom him and John Newsom been rotating off that edge together. Newsom will likely see a few more snaps. Newsom he's out there making plays. He's in the face of the quarterback. His stats really haven't shown it. So, yeah, you can look at Newsom and say he's a guy you can grab if you're in long format football. But the big point there that we need to make aware of, Eric Norwood should be back and healthy pretty soon.
Yeah, I saw him on the sideline, kind of came by where I was during the game, and he looks like he's getting very close. He was walking without any kind of a noticeable limp, and has obviously been out since training camp. Hasn't actually gotten onto the field yet with the Riders. As he gets closer, yeah, that's going to be a big factor. And obviously on Tuesday, as we record this, the Riders, the rumor mill came out, or whatever you want to call it, the story on Tuesday about that the Riders looked into the availability of Greg Hardy of the NFL, and someone that Many people will know about his background. The Riders are looking for as many pass rushers and those types of players as they can get. And I imagine the way it's kind of sounding, the timing of it seems to be prior to the signing of Norwood. Just from Chris Jones's response, it seems like the way that they're talking about it when they looked into it, they were looking for defensive linemen to come in. And to me, it seems like this preceded Eric Norwood signing. And I think once Norwood comes in, they're really going to have a unbelievable rotation, especially with Justin Capicotti having a breakout game for them this week.
Those who don't know Eric Norwood, Google him. Watch some of his YouTube highlights for the Ticats. Unbelievable how he can single-handedly take a game over. We'll get to that when we get into waiver wire ads. All right, Montreal, some only a couple of injuries, but a pretty big one if you're an Alouettes fan. Kevin Glenn left the game on Monday. Obviously, he came back from an eye injury, left the game on Monday after taking a low hit. Raheem Cato came in, didn't look very impressive, and Glenn came back from there on in. It almost seems to me like they're just waiting for Vernon Adams to come back, recovering from the concussion. To me, they're not really going to give Brandon Bridge a chance. They want to give Vernon Adams the keys pretty soon. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I kind of would agree with you on that. It seemed like, and that was another late one, Vernon Adams out with the concussion prior to the Toronto game, so he wasn't in the lineup. But it seemed like Kevin Glenn struggled a little bit against what is a good Toronto Argonauts defense. He faces his former team, the Saskatchewan Roughriders, on Friday, which is another good defense. And I think what you're also seeing is Glenn limiting the number of players that he uses in that offense. It's something that I think we've talked about. He's not a big guy to be looking at for DFS, especially with the price tag he comes at. If he's not able to go, obviously the Raheem Cato factor comes in, and people are going to be down on him based on his performance against Hamilton, so he'd be a tough guy to trust. And then obviously the other injury for the Alouettes, Marc-Olivier Brouillette throws a massive hit on Vidal Hazelton, who goes to Twitter on Tuesday night and is quite livid and says, watch for the next game, I'm going after him, basically. Brouillette left the game with a head injury. Dominic Termanson, former UBC Thunderbird, comes in relief of him.
Nice to see Brouillette did come back on the sideline, though, and he was taking part and cheering the team on. And you know what? People balk at that kind of stuff and the intent to attack somebody, but it creates competition. How often in pro sports, when somebody beaks off like that, is there actually something like repercussions paid aside from the Todd Bertuzzi incident that even if you're living under a rock, you know that name? Like, how often does that actually happen, the repercussions?
Exactly.
All right, moving into Friday's game. Jeremiah Johnson. Oh boy, if you're a BC Lions fan, if you're any type of fantasy football format fan, you've been waiting for this guy. We had him ranked so high coming into the season. An ankle injury, he's been gone for a couple of weeks. Anthony Allen filled in respectively, and being Tuesday night recording time, the BC Lions like to hold their cards to the chest pretty tight. So no real word on who's going to be getting the snaps heading into this weekend's action.
Yeah, and regardless of who's in there against the Calgary Stampeders defense, who are banged up this week, we'll get to that in their part. But as far as the running back goes for BC, that could be a bit of a sleeper. Obviously, Allen has seen his salary go up on DraftKings each and every week, so he's not quite the value that he was when he first came into the lineup. But whether it's Johnson or Allen, there is the potential it could be both, but if it is one or the other, they'll be a good start. If it is a timeshare carry, then suddenly it is a little bit more of a question mark, and there is the possibility it could be that with the injury to Nick Moore.
1A, 1B, nothing wrong with that. And Nick Moore, yeah. If you're going to go big, you may as well go big and then go home, right? Nick Moore, nice touchdown catch, but on the celebration, good night, Irene. He's gone for the season. And kind of what has spelled Nick Moore's career since leaving BC the first time. Geraldo Baldwin, if you watch the preseason, this guy, boy, was he exciting to watch. He'll come in replacement, and Brian Burnham will get a lot of the targets that Nick Moore was getting. So if you're a BC Lions fan, keep your eye on those two.
Yeah, Baldwin, obviously, the big thing with him is his salary on DraftKings. Comes in only at $3,000 salary. So if you're looking for a little bit of value and filling out a roster, and you've got, and you know, obviously this week when you've got such high potential for Adarius Bowman and Darrell Walker, the Edmonton Eskimos, suddenly that $3,000 salary looks very nice, and Baldwin could come in and really produce in that. He's going to be. So he's someone that has been around the Lions for some time and goes by the nickname Amsterdam, grew up in the Netherlands and played at Boise State. He's not that raw of a player as he once was. He's picked up the Lions offense. He's going to be the starter according to Wally Buono, and they've released all of his competition at that position, so they're confident enough that Baldwin can be the starter for the rest of the season.
Calgary Stampeders, they're getting a starter back, a Canadian, and one that people are pretty excited about. Lamar Durant missed the last few games with a sprained ankle, making a big catch in near the goal line. Simone Charbonneau-Campo has filled in nicely for him, but Simone Charbonneau-Campo likely is going to be filling the rest of the season. That's just how his role is going to be. Lamar Durant should be back in action this Friday night, and that should be a big one for the Stampeders.
Yeah, he'll be a big factor. Hasn't been out since that BC game in week 1 with the sprained ankle, and he could be a big target. As Bo Levi Mitchell, it seems like he likes those big targets. Bakari Grant has been kind of filling that role, 6'4". Durant also a big receiver, and there's the potential there for Durant to, as the season goes on, especially in season-long formats, to be a really big factor in the Calgary offense.
Frank Beltray, second week in a row, missed practice on Monday. He was in a walking boot last week, and the guy replacing him, we'll get to that a little more when we get into waiver wire ads, but Jagarrett Davis turned some heads last week against the Bombers. Beltray with a foot injury, likely going to be a little while yet. Micah Johnson left practice on Thursday, missed Monday and Tuesday. Left the game part of me last week on Thursday, missed practice Monday and Tuesday. Zach Minter came in replacement. It looks like it's some kind of stomach flu, or word really isn't too clear on what it is.
The word that came out on Tuesday, it was still the leg injury that he suffered on Thursday that took him out of the game, and it seems like it's something that has continued on into the week. No real decision yet on whether he'll play yet on Friday, but if he's out, that's a big man in the middle that the Stampeders will be missing.
Huge, especially when there's some big guys coming at you, the BC Lions. Taylor Reid back in action. Boy, he big one for the Calgary Stampeders. They're big. Their biggest offseason signing, I would say, arguably. Alex Singleton looked pretty good in replacement duty, but Taylor Reid, they're going to be glad to have him back.
Yeah, return to practice on Monday, so it looks like he'll be good to go, and Duron Mayo, who was banged up the week prior to the bye as well, is healthy enough to go, so they're back to their starters at the linebacker position.
Brandon Smith, a great long format fantasy football player, had a left hand injury, left the game Thursday, but he's back in practicing this week. Osagie Odiasi came in his replacement, but Brandon Smith looks like he should be good to go. And that's, you know what, probably safe to say one of the most underrated players. He still performs at a high level. For whatever reason, he just doesn't get the accolades. One of the top defensive backs in the league. Brandon Smith is a fantastic football player.
Yeah, he is, and he generally in the halfback position get one of the top slot backs from the other team. So the Stampeders having that continued veteran presence in their defensive backfield is an important player for them.
We'll get to that in the matchups. Looking at the Toronto Argonauts, no introduction needed. Ricky Ray, sprained MCL, 3 to 5 weeks could be gone, according to the Toronto Argos and Scott Milanovic. Logan Kilgore came in through a pick that was more than anything. He was just telegraphed that one, but not very good news for the Toronto Argonauts going forward.
Well, they've been carried up until this point. Ray hasn't been really the dominant player that many know him as. He's been a little bit more conservative, and the defense has been who has carried the Argos up until this point. They're going to need to carry them that much further, and an Ottawa Red Blacks team that has the question marks at quarterback themselves with injuries. So that's going to be an interesting game to get prepared for on Sunday, because Ottawa's not given a whole lot of information with their situation. And then as far as the Argonauts side goes, shifting over to the receiver side, not a whole lot of information coming out from them. Torrey Gurley again missed his second straight week. Devin Wiley came in and he performed very well, just like I've been telling you, Dave, since April or May.
I was waiting for that.
When Wiley signed with the Argos, that he once he learned that offense, he was going to be someone to watch for, and really does carry that Weston Dressler label, because they are similar receivers. I was telling the people I was watching with that this could be the next Weston Dressler in the league, and then as we get back to the Vidal Hazelton injury, suffered a head injury, back injury, left the game after the taking his shoulder pads off with back pain. One possibility with that, as far as the Argos go, they might shift players inside and outside. They have Wallace Miles, Phil Bates. They still have Kevin Elliott and Deontay Spencer, and contrary to what we were saying on Twitter, Deontay Spencer is still going to be out until about the second week of August on the 6-game injury list. Same with Kevin Elliott. So the possibilities are there as far as Kenny Shaw goes, that maybe he could shift to one of their outside receiver positions. Wallace Miles also has that ability to shift around to different positions in the receiving group. But as far as the Argos go, there's a lot of different possibilities. The most consistent one, and the one that obviously carries the most value, could be Kenny Shaw.
And if you wonder why that's that date of August 12th, well, the Argos head on bye week into week 7, so that adds in another week for that 6-game injured list. Matt Black, yeah, he's in for replacement for Jermaine Gabriel. He left the game with a neck injury, saw him being worked on the sidelines. Thomas Gordon came in, a guy that the Argos have been pretty high on since training camp. They felt that he probably could have beat out Gabriel and Black for the starting position, if not for being injured. And if Matt Black isn't able to go, expect Thomas Gordon to be in there, and who knows what can happen if that guy gets in the lineup.
Yeah, another name to watch for in that Toronto defense is Rich Stubler has done some really good things with that group.
Ottawa Red Blacks, Trevor Harris, left the game with a knee injury on Friday. We're recording on Tuesday night. Word is that it'll come out on Wednesday. What's the 411? Well, Henry Burris right now is throwing deflated footballs. If he gets cleared to throw fully inflated footballs, and Trevor Harris, in fact, cannot go, Burris may actually get pulled off the 6th game, and Brock Jensen may be backup. Or Jensen could start. Any one of the scenarios right there.
Yeah, and that's one of those ones. Watch the media on Twitter and on your different channels. Also watch as the depth charts come out, because that could be the difference of $10,000 or $11,000 as far as DraftKings salary down to Brock Jensen at just a $6,000 salary. Suddenly you could find yourself with a little bit more flexibility on your roster if it is Jensen and you're confident enough to start him for another week.
Arnaud Gascon-Nedon left the game on Friday. Right leg injury apparently doesn't appear too serious, according to Dan's favorite coach in the CFL, Rick Campbell, on Monday. So Andrew Marshall did come in duty there, but Gascon-Nedon, what a season that guy's having.
Yeah, starts out with 3 sacks on the season. Has Rick Campbell so excited that he might actually wear his hat straight for a game.
So you texted that to me during the game, and I actually kind of chuckled over that one. So Rick Campbell's gaining a lot of fans in the CFL this year, is he not? Oh, boy. He's probably the most popular coach, thanks to Duron Carter. All right, Johnny Sears, not very popular amongst receivers or quarterbacks, known for how he plays on the edge. Well, right now, he's got a leg injury. He'll probably be out for a little bit, but Hamilton's on the bye week anyway. Dom Ellis came in, the former Montreal Alouette, and his replacement there. And speaking of the Hamilton Ticats, moving into top players of the week, Jeremiah Mazzoli kind of came out of nowhere. A little bit of a wink to J.C. Sherritt, as Dan did mention during the injury segment, coming out of the lineup, potentially why Mazzoli had so much success. 32.84 points last week on DraftKings, and if you did manage to have him in your lineup, you probably reap the rewards. Yeah,
we'll get to it in the value portion, but $8,400, and Mike Riley, the number 2 as far as points go for quarterbacks. So a bit of a shootout. Sometimes that's all it takes, is picking out the shootout game, as Riley gets over 30 points himself.
Brandon Retley, 17.3 points. John White at 15.6. Brandon Retley probably could have had a little more if not misused. Personal soapbox. Sorry. Brad Sinopoli, 35.6. People say that's out of nowhere. Why didn't you see that coming? Well, has to do with quarterback-receiver relationship. I will say that to a T. Brock Jensen loved him some Brad Sinopoli. Naaman Roosevelt, say my name and say my name. And 35.2. As we had asked, Dan had said the past couple of weeks when getting asked about Ricky Collins, Naaman Roosevelt is a guy who's going to be consistently getting targets, and he did. 35.2. We'll let Dan expand on that in a second as we wrap this segment up. Darrell Walker, 35. Weston Dressler, 33.8. Darius with 29.1. And if you had the Calgary Stampeders defense last week, you cashed in with 15 points.
Yeah, the big one with the Stampeders, obviously, the pick 6 from Joe Burnett sealing it for the Stampeders late in that game.
Naaman Roosevelt, as mentioned before, Dan and I are both a big fan of that guy. As we get into the matchups, probably a chance to expand more of that there. Oh, look, his name's in the value players. Okay, we'll get there right away. As we mentioned, Jeremiah Masoli, 32.84 at $8,400 salary.
Yeah, and, first half, it seemed like Jeremiah Masoli wasn't going to be doing a whole lot for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, and once again, the calls for Jeff Matthews came through, and Kent Austin stuck with his guns. He stuck with Masoli, and Masoli decided to shift it up a little bit as far as which receiver he went to. And many people in the long format fantasy finally threw their hands up and said, finally, Luke Tasker gets a majority of the targets in that second half. And what happens? Masoli goes on a run and gets the top value points as far as quarterbacks.
And Luke Tasker, he may get a few more targets in the next coming weeks with Mr. ZC on his way. ZC, Zach Caleros, sorry, don't want to discriminate any of our listeners. Brock Jensen in Ottawa, $6,000 for the top value player, 26.14 points. If you started Brock Jensen coming into that game, message us right now. I will give you my bank account and my life savings.
Yeah, it was a highly unlikely thing, especially with how Trevor Harris was going, and Jensen doesn't really even come in on short yardage that often, so it was completely out of nowhere, and good for you if you started him. The top running back value players, Anthony Coombs finally makes it on this list.
Finally!
It seemed like he was on the biggest disappointment list week after week, but at a $3,700 salary, he picks up 13 points. And as we've talked about, Brandon Retley, a $5,800 salary this past week, 17.3 points. It could have been more, like you said, Dave, because they were down in the Toronto end very late in the game, hand the ball off. Once, doesn't get the touchdown. Brandon Bridge fumbles the snap on the second try and isn't able to get the handoff and has to roll out to the left and doesn't get the touchdown himself. Had Retley, I think, got that second carry, I think the push was there from the offensive line and there would have been more points. Retley, we've talked about it all year with him. He's going to be a guy just like what you saw on Monday. Lots of runs on the ground and lots of targets through the air. He's going to be a great fantasy play, especially with that low salary on DraftKings.
Is he not fun to watch, though? Watch his legs go. Boy, can that guy motor. And Brandon Retley, a quick shout out to Ted Mitsikas before we get into our social media segment. It's a little way down the road yet, but he said if Retley would have got that touchdown, he would have been in the money in DraftKings. So sorry about that, Ted. Tough call on that one. Brandon Retley, yeah, you got some value out of his salary. 35.6 points last week, and boy, oh boy, that game was out of nowhere.
Yeah, for Brad Sinopoli in Ottawa in that 35.6. I think he said Brandon Retley again there.
Did I say Brandon Retley? See, I love that guy. I love me some Brandon Retley. Can't get enough for Brandon Retley.
But for Sinopoli, $7,400 salary on DraftKings, and it, like you said, really did come out of nowhere. The week before, the big receiver was Greg Ellingson, and then we don't really need to get into too much about the Chris Williams first 3 weeks. But as far as Sinopoli goes, something that's interesting to watch, and I'm going to be watching for it this week because he's going to be up against Nick Lewis, is Otha Foster in the Sam linebacker position. Otha Foster gets to the ball. He gets in position. He gets tackles. He makes plays. He's a great player, but there's some times that he can get out of position, and Sinopoli made him pay on a couple of occasions. I'm not completely convinced that I'm going to be completely on board for the receivers going against Foster every week, but it makes me concerned because Sinopoli and the week before, Nick Moore had a big play for the BC Lions. Other value players at the receiver position, and Anthony Parker, another one out of nowhere, a $3,600 salary on DraftKings, 21.1 points. Roosevelt, who we've also mentioned, $7,900, 35.2 points, and Kenny Shaw, $4,700 salary on DraftKings, 25.6 points, and he can thank Torrey Gurley for being out of the lineup both the last 2 weeks and Vidal Hazelton's injury. It seems like the receivers are dropping like flies in Toronto, and Kenny Shaw is the beneficiary of that.
And the one thing to keep in mind with that Toronto offense, like Bo Levi Mitchell is probably the only other quarterback in the league that does this, but Ricky Ray spreads the ball around. If he's going to be out long term, keep an eye on Toronto receivers. Logan Kilgore, I don't think, is going to hit 7, 8, 9 receivers in a game. So just be aware of that as you're compiling your rosters. The Saskatchewan Roughriders defense, boy oh boy, we've said it from week 1 of our fantasy podcast episode, our fantasy football podcast. Saskatchewan Roughriders defense are going to get better and better and better and better, and by the time they hit Labor Day, they'll be nowhere near what they were in 2015 at $4,400 for a salary and 12 points last week.
Yeah, and the big one I think for them also was the sacks. There was the potential there. There was also a special teams touchdown that added to that number, and just some other things. There is just the potential for more and more and more with them. It seems like, as far as the interceptions go, they're very close on a few instances. I know we've talked about it in the BC game a couple weeks ago. The drops from the defensive backs. We'll get to the individual players, but there's some new additions that are going to be coming, or a new addition specifically coming into the lineup. I anticipate this week that could make a difference in that secondary.
Biggest disappointments of the week? Well, Trevor Harris, surprise, surprise, need not advertise it anymore at $11,200 salary. 0.96 points, obviously injured. Drew Willie, we did look at him as struggling last week against that Calgary defense at $8,900 salary, only 8.46 points.
Yeah, that one was to be predicted, and Matt Nichols came in relief. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but Matt Nichols will be getting the start. Willie has struggled, so for those that I think are hoping that Willie breaks out, it's going to be up to Matt Nichols in the weeks going forward.
Andrew Harris, not a great performance for $7,600, 9.5 points, and really more than anything, for whatever reason, the Bombers just got away from the run, and I think that they're not getting creative enough with the way they're incorporating Andrew Harris's touches. I think that's probably the one thing right now that's frustrating him more than anything.
That's the one part of it too, but that 9.5 points in past weeks, you wouldn't have been all that disappointed as far as the running backs go. You talk about some weeks where there's running backs getting 1 or 2 points, and I think this week for some reason there was just a lot of points from running backs. You were seeing guys like Anthony Coombs and Stefan Logan and different guys getting the ball in their hands that hadn't in previous weeks and putting up points and yards, and it just seemed like for Harris, especially at that big value, and he's one of the premier backs in the league, if he's going to be one of those top salaried players, you're going to expect big production from him. 9.5 isn't that bad. And then shifting to the second running back as far as disappointments, Curtis Steele, we talked about the injury. He left the game and was in street clothes at the end of the game and dumped the Gatorade pail on Chris Jones at the end of the game. He came in at a $5,300 salary and only produced 1.5 points.
Chris Williams, bit of a disappointment again in a pretty tough matchup there. We'll get that. We'll explain that more as we do get into matchups and highlight why that was so difficult. But 2.85 points again, and really a product probably of Brock Jensen more than anything. He tried to, I don't know if he tried to get him the ball, but is not really courageous, as a Trevor Harris would be with pinpoint accuracy, dropping it in Williams' hands in double and triple coverage. But Jensen a little scared to send it out that way when the fierce coverage he was facing. And Greg Ellingson, after a huge game a couple of weeks ago at $8,100 salary, 5.1 points. And Sinopoli, as we did mention, looked good with Mr. Jensen at quarterback.
Yeah, and we've said it in week after week. It's pick your poison as far as the Ottawa receivers go. 1 week it's Williams, and actually for 3 straight weeks it was Williams. The following week it was Ellingson. Last week here it was Sinopoli, who knows, as weeks go forward, they still have Ernest Jackson there. If Burris comes back in, anticipate that Jackson's numbers are going to go up. But it's back-to-back where you not sure whether to go to Ellingson and Sinopoli as that number 2 guy in the Ottawa offense.
But Al Hazelton is a guy we expected to put up some pretty good points last week at $7,300 salary. Only 5.8, obviously injured. Looks like he probably would have had a little bit more success, as we already talked about him before. And Rob Begg, 5,300 points at $5,300 at 4.5 points. And Tom Pernot was all over that guy last week, as Rob Begg only saw 1 catch.
Yeah, and that's one for the Rough Riders. They're going to need to get Rob Begg going. He's going to need to be someone that's sort of like a Brad Sinopoli type receiver, catches passes across the middle for first downs. He did have one deep for I believe, about 35 yards. But for the Rough Riders, it's important for them that they get Rob Begg going, and that probably won't happen until Darian Durant is back.
Rounding out the defense disappointments, Edmonton Eskimos and the Hamilton Ticats at $4,800 and $5,500 respectively. -4 points and +4 points. And yeah, that's somewhere along the way. If you were an Edmonton Eskimos defense owner, you're going, yeah, I'm going to cash in on this. But that was over with. And that turned into a bit of a shootout. So those are some of the big ones there that ended up on the disappointment list. Boy, oh boy. Do we ever have a social media following? And if you're brand new to the CFL game, and if you're brand new to the podcast, and if you've been a long-time DFS player, Dan and I grateful for all the questions we get day and night. Dan and I literally, our phones are blowing up with questions of this and that, and the starts and ads, and guys you should avoid, and is this guy chalky, or and we love having all those questions come in. You can follow us on Twitter at CFL Fantasy FTB. Happy to support you in that. And good grief, do we ever have a lot of social media questions to get through? Let's fire through a few of these. You ready to roll?
Go.
Let's do this. All right. Senior Ami at Senior Ami asked us today, how long before the Emperor's new clothes level of coaching and competence in Montreal is exposed and resolved? Thought we'd start it off with a bit of a lighthearted one.
Yeah, that's one for sure that, Montreal fans are very disappointed with the Alouettes' performance thus far this season, and it's falling all on Jim Popp's head. He's the general manager, he's the head coach, he's the most seems to be the one that makes the most wrong challenges to the officials, something that many fans have talked about. And it's been, for the most part, their offense that's been the one that has been the biggest question mark for them. Anthony Calvillo is a legend in that city. People are pointing the finger at Jim Popp rather than Anthony Calvillo, and I think we talked about it a little bit. It almost seems like Calvillo is just still getting his feet wet. You see Jason Moss in Edmonton and Dave Dickinson, when they came in, worked with coaches that were very long-serving veteran coaches in the CFL, and it seemed like a seamless transition for them as offensive coordinators. I think once the Alouettes hit that bye week, Jim Popp's really going to be looking at his roster and the players that they have. But until that time, I think it's going to be a little bit of a disappointing season for the Alouettes. And
if you are new to the game, we should probably explain that the last couple of years, the Montreal Alouettes have been well known for publicity stunts. Chad Johnson, Michael Sam, all these things that have caused some ruffling in the dressing room. So you wonder how much longer it's going to be. Not to mention the Riders are probably going to blow them out of the water this weekend too. So that's going to be nice to add into the whole repertoire there. Okay, thanks for the question. Appreciate that. Kyle D. Barney at KYBBERS22. I guess I can grab this one. What happens to Parker if Mr. Lamar Durant plays this week? Well, Dan and I have said in weeks past, Anthony Parker, he does have skills and he has speed, but likely last week we would equate that to why his numbers were so inflated. Right after the Bombers' secondary, bang, injury is where Parker put up a lot of his points, his touchdowns. So Anthony Parker's not a regular featured target in the offense. Bo Levi Mitchell does spread the ball around well, but Lamar Durant, a big target. Bo Levi does like the big bodies. So we would imagine Parker's value drops down a little bit, and I know many are going to look at him and say, after a big week like that, man, Anthony Parker, he's going to be great to own. I'd say be a little more hesitant on him now that Lamar Durant's back in action. Would you agree?
I would agree with that one. Durant is going to be a target across the middle of the field, whereas Parker's at that strong side of the field. He's going to be getting those 45-yard passes cross field for Bo Levi Mitchell. And Mitchell's the type of quarterback that doesn't make bad decisions, doesn't turn the ball over with stupid plays very often. So as far as him making that wide side throw, I don't see Bo Levi Mitchell really testing that very often. I think as far as Parker goes, he's going to be a screen type receiver, catching a 3 or 4 yard pass and taking it with the yards after the catch. But as far as Durant goes, Durant's going to be a red zone target. He's going to be an every play target for Bo Levi Mitchell.
Thanks for the question. Ryan Sorensen at RyanOss123 sent us in. Speaking of a guy that could be avoided, Nate Adjei, does he have any value? Obviously, the replacement for Nate Kuhorn out for a few weeks. And what about Nick Dembski? I guess maybe I'll grab Adjei if Dan wants to grab Dembski, if we'll go that route. I would equate Nate Adjei along the similar conversation as Anthony Parker. Nate Kuhorn didn't get very many targets in the Edmonton Eskimos, maybe 4 or 5 a game at the very most. He saw a few more because of the Jason Moss offense, but Nate Adjei likely doesn't have great value. Except this week against the Bombers, anybody wearing green and gold on the offensive side of the ball probably going to catch a touchdown, including the offensive line. I'm just saying.
Yeah, and as far as Nick Dembski goes, the big one with that one, Shamad Chambers, looks like he's going to be back in the lineup. So for Dembski this week, his value is going to be on the return game. He's going to be shifting back into the role he was in for the first 3 games for the Rough Riders on the season. So as far as on the offense, I don't think he'll have the value unless Chambers is out of the lineup. Then for that one, I think he has similar to last week in the Rough Riders offense.
Thanks for the question, Ryan. James Brimacombe at James Brimacombe. Let's talk about BC wide receivers. Is Geraldo Baldwin a good play at $3,000, or is it better to go for Gore at $5,900? I think we kind of already covered that off a little bit, but Dan, if you want, you can expand on that.
Just as far as Sean Gore goes at that $5,900 value, the Calgary Stampeders are really pushing Fred Bennett at that weak side corner this week. They have him in competition with Keontae Evans as far as snap goes at practice, and I think they really want Bennett to get going to the level he's been playing at for years in the CFL. It seems this season he's fallen down a little bit, a lot more catches per attempt to each receiver that he's covering. And I think for Sean Gore, it's easy to look at the statistics and say that he could have a big week, considering that Bennett's given up big weeks in past weeks to Chris Williams in Ottawa, and then just this last week, Darvin Adams of Winnipeg was over 100 yards. Gore, I don't think will get to that number value. So if you're going to go for that extra $2,900 in salary on DraftKings, I'd almost say roll the dice with Baldwin, but I think I might also say maybe look elsewhere if you're really looking. I think Baldwin is a little bit more of a Hail Mary. You could also talk about Brian Burnham at $5,000. We have Brian Burnham actually higher in our weekly DFS rankings for this week. As an inside receiver, he's going to be getting Nick Moore's targets now. He had a big game against Calgary in week 1 with, I believe, 88 yards. So I think if you're going to talk about those three and you're going to talk about paying up, I think you're better to save $900 and go for the $5,000 value, or sorry, the $5,000 salary of Brian Burnham.
All right, thanks for the question. Billy Harrell at Bill Snake 23's got a couple. I'll take the first one. Who do you like better this week, Grigsby or Rutley? Both the same price with a good matchup. You know what? I'm looking at Nick Grigsby. Trayvon Van is going to be coming back very, very soon. He's been doing stairs while the Red Blacks have been practicing. It shouldn't be too long before he's doing contact, and he's a guy that he's going to take Grigsby's job as soon as he's back. So Nick Grigsby hasn't really had a big game because he's been trying to get back up to game speed. I think as the Toronto Argonauts are banged up and as that game wears on, Grigsby likely is going to see a lot more touches just from how tired the Argos are, and if it is in fact Brock Jensen, he's going to rely a little more on Grigsby too. As for Brandon Rutley, you really don't know week in and week out what Jim Popp is going to do offensively. Rutley, so many times, he even retweeted us in a tweet where I said at halftime, Jim Popp should have a pretty basic game plan coming in for halftime. Brandon Rutley, and Rutley retweeted that, likely maybe a little bit upset that he wasn't seeing more of the ball. So Brandon Rutley, he should be a guy who's going to get you over 20 points in DraftKings week in and week out, but likely I don't think he's going to be getting a lot of the ball as much as Grigsby potentially. So between the two of them, I see maybe 1.5 to 2 point difference. So Grigsby or Rutley, if it really comes down to that, I would say maybe Grigsby, but either or, you can't go wrong with either one of them this week, unless Dan would have anything to disagree.
I'd be on the flip side. I would be more on Rutley just in terms of Kevin Glenn and how much he's going to use Rutley as a receiver out of the backfield. Ottawa didn't, in the last game against Toronto, really use Grigsby a whole lot in that game. As far as Rutley goes, I think, in my opinion, I think that, maybe he won't get the carries, but I still think in that passing game, Jim Pop's going to like what he saw last week and try for that again.
I was just trying to play, I've been on Brandon Rutley's cheers squad the whole game, so just trying to dial it back a little bit. So Dan clearly exposed my theory there. Bill Snake's got a question for Dan. Not sure, Bill, if you are a subscriber to our weekly DFS rankings or not, but here's a question. Here's an idea going forward. Why not do the top 2 wide receiver matchups and the top 2 wide receiver fades for the podcast? Dan obviously can answer that one.
As far as fades go, that is in our rankings. We have a feature in our weekly DFS rankings, and we've said it time and time again. Those can be purchased at onsidecfl.wordpress.com for $20. And in there, we have Sure Looks Cold as a feature in there, and a little bit of a write-up on each player, why we think that you should fade those particular players. And for the most part, we will go with the higher salaried guys as far as fades. To give a little bit away this week, I don't think you mind if we give one away, Dave. We're not very high on the guy that was our top running back last week, and that was Jerome Messam of the Calgary Stampeders. In there, we write up why we think that Jerome Messam will be down. And as far as the matchups go, I think you will hear from us as we go through them on the podcast what some of the key ones are. And we have talked about who some of the top cover guys are. Names like Ronnie Yell and Yell Hell. And then also AJ Jefferson from the Toronto Argonauts. Another name that is someone to really start watching for as it goes on is Buddy Jackson from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. There is a lot of those shutdown corners in this league, and as those guys go against the top receivers, we'll point those guys out.
Roland Geisler's got a question for us at RAULIEG, and kind of one we've already touched on and we're going to touch on again coming up into the matchup. So we'll just breeze right by this one. Assuming Jeremiah Johnson is healthy, who's the guy in BC? Do they stick with Allen or do they roll a 1A, 1B? We kind of already touched on that, Roland, if you've been listening to this podcast, and we'll get into that as we get into the matchup. So Superstar Sports DFS, Tristan, he's a big fan of ours, does tweet us quite often during the games. Bowman versus Williams, who's got the better matchup? Who should we plug in on our lineups, or do we fade both? Do you want to wait for that one as we get into matchups, or should we talk about that?
That one's an easy one. The Edmonton Eskimos are going to put up points this week. That is a guarantee.
Period. Jordan at Zap. Since the big win against the Red Blacks, do you think the Riders will turn their season around? Not really totally a fantasy football kind of question, but yeah, I think we're okay answering that one. Yes, the Riders will turn their season around. Dan, the stats guy, was right on the sidelines there, and he got a great picture of a guy who was pretty elated after the game, and clearly that is great news for Saskatchewan
Rough Riders
fans.
President Craig Reynolds on the sideline with a fist pump and a look to the skies, quite relieved with that. And I think the key to the Rough Riders turning their season around is the defense. It's been talked about the number of points that they've given up, but we said prior to this game the key for them with that is one statistic, and that's how they do on second and long. They did it again last week against Ottawa. They limited them on second down. Once they get going and really start shutting teams down like they have been on second down, look out for this defense. Chris Jones can make them easily the top defense in the league if he gets it going with them.
Thanks for the question. Ted Mitsikas, a couple more to go here. Ted, always a faithful listener and a follower. Appreciate that. Is this a week for an Eskimos heavy lineup? I can't even finish reading this question. Yes, Ted, this is a week for an Eskimos heavy lineup. Thanks for your question. Jeremy Dean, JHIMMY down, the final one. Who do you like better in the flex, Grigsby or Nick Lewis for Dan the Stats guy?
As far as this one goes, Nick Lewis should get some more targets like he saw in this last week. I've already talked about his matchup against Otha Foster. As far as Grigsby goes, he'll be one of the top running backs of the week, and I think as far as this Ottawa offense goes, they'll get the ball moving. They've done well against the Toronto defense. They're likely to get Grigsby some red zone looks during the game. So I'd probably go Grigsby over Nick Lewis, even though Lewis will be targeted. I just don't see Nick Lewis breaking a big one the way he can. I don't see him getting much of that against the Saskatchewan Roughriders defense that's really starting to fly around.
Yeah, laying a big one is what the Alouettes are going to do, and definitely not break. You know what? And a quick shout out to Nick Lewis for surpassing 5,000 yards receiving, 55. Okay, I feel stupid. What was it? 5,000 catches in his career. Like 5,000 yards receiving, that's horrible. 5,000 catches in his career, and Nick is a guy that love him or hate him. He's a personable guy. He will respond to you on Twitter, and he's a guy that you just love to interact with. So congratulations, Nick Lewis, on that milestone.
Yeah, like you said, one of the biggest personalities in the CFL. Once his career is over, maybe we'll see him on TSN.
Guaranteed. Absolutely. All right, time for some top waiver wire ads right before we get into our weekly matchups. Matt Nichols, a guy that is going to start for the Bombers this week, playing against his former team, and many people aren't too high on Matt Nichols. Some people are a fan of Matt Nichols. Either way, Matt Nichols, if you need a starter in long format football this week, probably a guy that's going to get you 3, maybe 4 points. So, hey, not a bad guy to add. Or, you know what? If he hangs in there, maybe some garbage time points. So the Bombers are really good for him.
Yeah, and then the second one being on there, Brock Jensen in Ottawa. If he is started, check on that in your waiver wire ads. If you are able to, for example, in an auction format, get Jensen for cheap to replace Henry Burris and Trevor Harris on your team. If you're that desperate for a quarterback, Brock Jensen is another option. And then one to stash. If this guy's on your waiver wire, get him now. I think that's an under.
Can I join your league?
If I can join your league and start out my team with him as your quarterback, none other than Zach Collaros. The Ticats come back from the bye next week. If you can stash Collaros now, look out.
He should already be stashed on your roster, but if he's not, definitely grab him. Anthony Coombs, a guy that Dan and I have been, especially Dan's been looking for some big things from, and he's got some pretty good measurables. We don't really understand why Anthony Coombs hasn't been featured more often in the Argos lineup, but likely going to see a few more touches as Brandon Whitaker, that body might get a little bit banged up.
They use Coombs in multiple ways. They use him out of the backfield. They use him as a receiver. They also use him a little bit in a return game. Not any different than how he was used in college. Both Dave and I covered the Canada West CIS football on radio and TV, so we've both seen what Anthony Coombs can do once he gets going. One of the most dominant players in Canada West in the last 10 years. If he can get some opportunities with the Argos, he can be a very good fantasy performer for your season-long team.
Not to mention the Argos traded up to get this guy.
Yeah, they have high hopes for him, but it's just a matter of him getting that opportunity.
Wide receivers, we got quite a few here. Geraldo Baldwin already beat that to death. He's a guy you want to grab. Greg Wilson, only a few points, a handful in long format last week, and in DraftKings, he's a guy that you can continually rely on because he's going to be in the place of Joe West for a number of weeks to come.
Yeah, and not a big start for him this past week, but as the weeks go forward and he gets comfort level, watch for him. Another couple names, Thomas Mayo from Winnipeg. He had chemistry with Matt Nichols in the fourth quarter. Devin Wiley, who we've talked about, started in place of Torrey Gurley. I think that he's etched himself a role beyond just as a fill-in. I could see him going into a slot back role as injuries come up. Ryan Langford from Saskatchewan, all depends on the John Charles situation. And then you have one in Montreal here of a couple guys that could be long looks.
Marcus Henry's a guy that in years past, the Red Blacks expansion year, Henry was the leading receiver and leading targeted guy. But couldn't really get back in the lineup and has floated around on a couple of rosters now with the Alouettes. Jacoby Ford is another one, found himself in the Eskimos training camp, gone, and now on Montreal. Might need a little more veteran presence with all the young guys floating around in the Alouettes receiving corps, so there'd be a chance for one of those guys to make an appearance in coming weeks. And a guy who grabbed a hold of his opportunity on the defensive end for the Stamps last week, Jagarrett Davis, took over for the injured Frank Beltre. Likely going to be a couple more weeks, and Davis definitely, not sure if it's more of a product of just playing against the Bombers, but Davis did look pretty good last week, picking up a couple of sacks.
Who knows how long Frank Beltre could be out of the lineup for the Stampeders. So if he is out for an extended period, then Davis could be someone. So keep an eye on if you are looking for weeks going forward, see what kind of opportunity Davis will have.
Stashing a guy on your roster right now, go do it. Eric Norwood, the Saskatchewan Roughriders, you talked about him early on. It's probably the time he's going to be ready to go very, very soon. So if you're in long format football and you have a couple of spots to put him on there, he's a guy you want to look at. A guy that coming into the season, every year I like to kind of assess and pick out my sleepers and stud performers and guys that will continually turn heads throughout the season. A couple years back, it was Abdul Kanay and TJ Lee. Need not be advertised. Mitchell White of the Montreal Alouettes started the season. He got cut, now on the Ottawa Red Blacks. He started last week for the Red Blacks, and boy, oh boy, is he going to continually be a big guy week in and week out.
He started at the field corner last week and lined up primarily against Nick Dembski of the Rough Riders, and I think we had talked about it. You had asked me where he would be lining up, and I think that was kind of a one-game feeling out process for White in the Montreal defense. I think Mark Nelson, the defensive coordinator in Ottawa, there was a little bit of a struggle on that boundary side against Naaman Roosevelt. You saw Abdul Kanay go out for a certain amount of time. Not sure if it was an injury or if it was just ineffectiveness. They brought Tristan Jackson, who came in and was burnt on the long touchdown pass by Roosevelt. And then the third one, Jarrell Gavins also filled in for a certain time. Finally, Kanay came back in, took the key penalty that you weren't a fan of, Dave, in the fourth quarter that allowed the Riders to get into field goal range to produce the victory. I think as far as Ottawa goes, I think Mitchell White will get settled into that boundary corner. I don't know if it'll be this week or if if the Red Blacks will wait a few weeks. But as far as fantasy goes, if you're looking for a defensive player for your season-long team, Mitchell White can be a big, big player for you.
Mitchell White is Abdul Kanay without the penalties. He's a guy who's going to get targeted, and he's a guy that's going to make plays and make some tackles. Darius Brooks in Saskatchewan will be making some plays. Brandon McDonald got released for, again, everybody's released Brandon McDonald. And surprised, are you, by this move?
A little bit surprised when it first came out. I think that was my first thought, was it looks like Brooks must be fairly close then if they're able to get rid of Brandon McDonald, who wasn't a great performer for the Riders last week. I think he was also one we had talked about, Otha Foster being one name as far as the production for Brad Snopley. Brandon McDonald's another one that, as far as those long touchdowns in coverage, Brandon McDonald got burnt by Snopley. So Darius Brooks is going to be a big name on that Saskatchewan Roughriders defense. You talk about how this defense is getting better each and every week. Darius Brooks is going to be a key player. By the end of the season, he very well could be the best defensive back for them.
Here's a hat trick for you. Bruce Johnson of the Bombers, back from injury. We talked about him earlier on. He's going to get a lot of tackles because he'll get targeted. He's going to make some plays, too. Look at his numbers last year. He was able to put up some decent numbers. Stephen Clark, a guy that we were pretty high on coming in, and he's going to jump in to TJ Lee's spot. He's going to be able to make some plays, as will Dom Ellis in Hamilton with Johnny Sears out. Fairly surprised with his release after training camp, as of course Mitchell White of Montreal. Both those guys got cut, but Dom Ellis can make plays, and he will attack the ball in Hamilton. And there's another guy to add in your long format football.
Yeah, Dominic Ellis is going to be someone that's going to fill a halfback role. He'll often go against one of the primary receivers for the opposing team. Don't know how long Johnny Sears is going to be out, but if you are looking for someone to maybe replace Sears, there's one way you could go. And then last couple of defensive backs for you to keep an eye on, maybe a couple to add. Devin Smith in Toronto, he was a starter last year. He retired in the offseason, came back to the Argonauts. Now he's starting again. He's a veteran halfback. And then the last one in Winnipeg with Macho Harris out. Brendan Morgan, it looks like, is going to be the starter at the safety position. There's some possibilities for tackles there.
All right, time to get into the matchups. This one should be, I don't know why I laugh at this. I'm sorry if you're a Winnipeg fan listening, and the irony is actually born and raised in Winnipeg. But it just the idea that there was so much off-season hype of the Bombers to turn it around. And coming into Commonwealth Stadium, when was the last time the Bombers actually won a game or even close? They get laughed out of the brick field each and every year. I got it
for you, Dave. Do you remember a certain play, exactly 10 years ago, Milt Stegall, we talked, other podcasts, I know the Rouge Radio guys talked about it, Milt Stegall goes for the improbable last-second touchdown. The Bombers beat the Eskimos with no time left on the clock. I think Stegall went, 95 yards for a touchdown? Something like that. That's the last time the Winnipeg Blue Bombers won at Commonwealth Stadium. A couple of the Bombers, Trent Corney being one of them, one of their draft picks this season. He was only 12 at the time that the Bombers last won in Edmonton.
And you can also add in a 1990 joke if you want there too. Long droughts are a thing for the Bombers. But a couple of former Bombers, I know we're going to talk that to death, Matt Dunnigan and Milt Stegall on the TSN broadcast this week. I just got to say, Matt Dunnigan, there's a lot of guys on TSN that do get whipped on, and people don't. We have a little bit of fun with Rod Black and Dwayne Ford on Twitter. That's fine. But Matt Dunnigan is a guy that I can't get enough of that guy. He cannot be on TV enough. Anytime Dunnigan opens his mouth, he's just an entertaining guy.
Yeah, we're going to see if we can maybe talk some fantasy, maybe have him on as a guest on the show here. But Matt Dunnigan definitely is someone that knows the league. He knows the history. And being a former coach in the league, he knows the makeup of a roster. He's someone that knows how to work with the ratio as far as nationals and internationals. He's a great guy to talk football with, and it's neat to see him also pump up fantasy football on the TSM broadcast.
All right, Dunnigan, if you're listening, we'd love to have you a guest on the show. I'm just saying, you can tweet us if you want. It's fine. All right, getting into the matchup here, the Bombers' number one feature receiver right now is going to be going up against Marcel Young, a weak side halfback, and basically the way these matchups are going to go. So if you're watching a football game and you're looking and going, oh, that guy's not playing against that guy as much, it's position versus position. And coaching staffs will look at this on the field and go, oh, okay, this guy's having a tough battle against this guy. Why don't we move him around the field? So Weston Dressler right now likely going to be matched up against Marcel Young. He had 7 catches on 10 targets the last time the Bombers played Edmonton, just under 70 yards. But Paul Appolise, in order to create some space for their big offseason signing, likely going to move him around the field.
Well, you saw it in past Eskimo games, and you saw it in that Hamilton game last week. You really have to go against the strong side of the field in Edmonton. John Ojo obviously is out for the year with the torn Achilles, and there's been a bit of a turnover week after week as far as corners go on the strong side of the field. I've got in our notes here that's possible your Anton Windsor might be starting at strong side corner for the Eskimos. I think Dressler, you're going to see him in motion a lot trying to get him to the strong side of the field into open space. So yeah, he will line up against Marcel Young quite a bit, but they'll try to get him on the move onto the strong side of the field.
Darvin Adams, the weak side wide receiver, is getting matched up against Pat Watkins. The last time these two guys met up, he only had 38 yards in receiving, 3 catches on 7 targets. Pat Watkins, me personally, is a bit of a soapbox player because Patty Watkins can make plays. He can jump routes. He can knock down balls because he's a big, lanky body. He's a tall defensive back. He's seen some time in the NFL. He's been on a couple of teams in the CFL. He's made some big plays, but Pat Watkins also can get caught flat-footed quite often. So the big thing for me is if they can get the ball out to Darvin Adams, if he can maybe, try and jump a step a little bit on Watkins, he might be able to catch him sleeping. But overall, I think that's going to be a difficult matchup for number 4.
Yeah, last week, Terrence Tolliver gets the surprise start for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, and he got a touchdown against Pat Watkins. There's a strong possibility if the Bombers get down into the red zone that Adams could get targeted.
Kenny Ladler's got a lot of tackles this year for the Eskimos at the Sam linebacker position, a difficult position to play. Jace Davis likely going to be seeing a lot of Kenny Ladler. He had 6 targets, 3 catches and 30 yards against the Esks in week 4. But the big thing for Ladler, I guess, is maybe right now you do see a lot of quarterbacks attacking that position and forcing Ladler to make plays. So Jace Davis may not be a bad play up against Kenny Ladler if at all he's able to see the ball, because Matt Nichols will be on his back.
And this is the possibility as far as Jace Davis goes to be that safety valve. You also talk about the other receivers on the strong side of the field for the Bombers. You have Rory Collard at the wide side receiver spot. That's an intriguing matchup because he could be a real sleeper. Receivers in that spot, you talked about it already. Anthony Parker for the Calgary Stampeders put up yards against that position, and it's been a number of different guys. Dion Ballou at the start of the year. Tyler Thornton's been in there. Solomon Means. They're trying to find the right fit in there, and until they are able to get someone, I guess, to have a strong game and get some confidence, teams are going to keep going after them.
Thomas Mayo is going to go right now probably in the depth-wise matched up against Cord Parks. Quarterbacks have challenged Cord Parks quite often this year and forced him to come up with the ball. So Mayo and Nichols, they did have a little bit of chemistry in the fourth quarter against the Stampeders. And it's funny how you watch a backup quarterback come in, and when they're playing against, they practice with the B squad, they'll look for those B squad players. And Thomas Mayo has had obviously some time to practice with Matt Nichols. So Cord Parks, not saying he's a bad football player, but quarterbacks have been attacking him this season and had a little bit of success.
There is a possibility there. And then ending up the Bombers offense there with Andrew Harris. The Eskimos are fairly stout against the run. You talk about the big man in the middle, Amando Sewell, and the big one also being J.C. Sherritt's health. If he's able to go, I don't think Harris has the effect that many are hoping him to have, especially at his price on DraftKings.
Mike Riley, yeah, he got a couple blindside hits pretty good last week, and he was running around, and Jamal Westerman and Adrian Hubbard have been pretty quiet. Adrian Hubbard obviously coming in favor of Sheon Green, who hasn't had a very banner season so far. Could be a big week for those Bomber bookends this year. I don't know, possibly, but Mike Riley, aside from that, he's going to be able to pick the Bombers secondary apart, and that's the best way to start off, preface this next segment here.
And you look at that last week, especially in that second half, obviously they had the big performance in the first half, put up a pile of yards on that Hamilton defense, but Mike Riley took that big pop from John Chick in the second half, and it seemed like that was the point that the wheels started coming off for the Edmonton offense, and Riley went to the sideline, chewed out his offensive line, and I think they're going to be out to prove something this week, because if your quarterback comes down the sidelines and screams at you at the top of his lungs, that for you as an offensive line should be a little bit of a call to action. And going as far as the receivers go for the Eskimos, Adarius Bowman, he'll be against Bruce Johnson. We already talked about Johnson healthy enough to come back, and that's what the Bombers are going to be looking for. They'll have him at that weak side halfback across from Bowman. You saw Bowman move around a lot last week against Hamilton, trying to get the ball in his hands. I think this week he's going to be one of those deep down the field targets for Mike Riley that he has been. Also, Darrell Walker. Walker has already seen this matchup against C.J. Roberts in week 4. He had a big 75-yard touchdown plus another 36-yard game. Besides that, it was only 5 catches for 44 yards for Walker. So the key for the Bombers' defense is to limit the big plays from those two big receivers, but that's going to be tough because Macho Harris is out of the lineup as the starting free safety. You have the young Brendan Morgan filling in there. I can just see, as far as these two big targets, they come with the big salaries on DraftKings, but they're going to be worth it in combination. If you want to stack a lineup, stack the Edmonton Eskimos, you've got Bowman, you've got Walker, and it's clear that Corey Watson's the number 3 receiver in that offense. He gets Mo Leggett, Dave, but I think you would say that Watson's another one you could go to.
Yeah, I think Watson was a guy I was pushing to have right up there in our top 5 on our weekly rankings and DraftKings. And I was going to say a quick comment on C.J. Roberts before the transition there, that it's unfortunate that Roberts has to get matched up against a big threat like Darrell Walker, because I don't think he's that bad of a football player. He did make some plays, but he's going to be busy this week, as will Mo Leggett, matched up against former Bomber Corey Watson. He'll likely be healthy, and a big sigh of relief to Winnipeg fans. And Watson had 5 catches and 6 targets last time for 48 and a TD. And red zone TD beat on that. But Corey Watson, I still think there's opportunity for success there. Mo Leggett's going to get in your face. Mo Leggett's also going to jump a route. So if Mike Riley is able to ball fake it a couple of times, he might be able to catch Leggett sleeping, and Watson could be able to cash in. As we look at Kevin Fogg, the strong side halfback this week, he matched up against Chris Getzlaff. Getzlaff only had 3 targets the last time against the Bombers, and Getzlaff has been one of those long-time soapbox players. Personally, for myself in the CFL, and I know Chris Getzlaff, I would personally say, kind of made himself a career thanks to all the big targets in Saskatchewan. And Chris Getzlaff, still a good Canadian receiver. He's not going to get up there with big yards week in and week out. And Kevin Fogg, he's making some plays for the Bombers. If there's one guy in the Winnipeg secondary, be it that they'll probably be on the field for 49 minutes in this football game on Thursday, but Kevin Fogg is a guy who can make plays. So Chris Getzlaff, I will finalize my thought with this. And Chris Getzlaff, you're a good football player. But popular belief out there is if you're matched up against a tough defensive back, you're probably not going to make the play. And I think Kevin Fogg could be that guy this week.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And the last one being the rookie, Terrence Frederick on the strong side corner for the Bombers. He gets Nate Ajay, the former Texas A&M Aggie. Frederick will make his season debut, but Ajay only had 1 target last week against Hamilton. It seemed like that was the prime one where he might get that. I don't know if he'll have anything more than a couple targets. I think right now he's just holding down the fort until Nate Kuhorn is healthy.
John White at running back. We've hoped for some big numbers out of him in past weeks, and we'll see what Khalil Bass and company have in store. And Bombers' run defense over years past, we've talked about at length, that being a little more susceptible to the pass underneath. And John White is a guy that doesn't often get catches out of the backfield, but when he does, he's able to make some plays. So probably going to be a lot more from scrimmage, but likely still going to have quite a bit of success against that Winnipeg defense, again, which you do predict to be on the field for quite some time.
Worst run defense in the CFL. John White, the top, as far as salary goes on DraftKings, the top valued running back. So I think if you're willing to spend the money, we've talked about some of the lesser salaried players as far as Brandon Rutley and Nick Grigsby. If you want to go for the big money one, John White could produce as the top running back this week.
Saskatchewan, Montreal, Friday night, 7 o'clock Eastern time. A doubleheader on Friday night. Mitchell Gale, we talked about him, is the quarterback. Could he be the guy to go forward? Darian Durant, we mentioned that earlier on. He likely will get another week. Well, Naaman Roosevelt, probably depth-wise, getting matched up against Jonathan Mincy. Mincy has made a couple of plays, including a pick that did get called back to penalty last week. But Al Hazelton was injured on Monday, and he did have the game on Monday. He had success against Mincy again, minus that touchdown that did get called back. And Naaman Roosevelt really comes down to, frankly, plain and simple, Naaman Roosevelt is a good receiver. He's going to see a lot of targets. Jonathan Mincy he will be a good defensive back, I think, in years to come in Montreal, but a young defensive back, going to be tired, going to be on the field for a long time. Naaman Roosevelt probably will have a lot of success.
Yeah, I'd agree on that one. And as far as Roosevelt goes, he's going to be in those double-digit targets each and every week until he gets sort of a veteran that knows what some of his tendencies are. But right now, there's really not a whole lot of film on Roosevelt aside from early on this season. Last year, he played the inside, so teams are still just learning what Roosevelt can do. He's a little bit of an unknown quantity. Is that the right word? Quantity? I don't know. As far as the Rough Riders go. But moving to the other Rough Riders receiver.
Unknown entity.
We'll go with
Got
that
it.
one, yeah.
Hey!
Beyond that, Ricky Collins, he'll get Javon Johnson. And Johnson, that's a neat matchup because Collins didn't get much for targets, only 2 targets last week against Ottawa. Johnson, a veteran cover guy that's just playing the halfback position for the first time this year. Not the best matchup for Collins, but I think he'll get some targets because I think they'll challenge Johnson a little bit. At the safety position, Marc-Olivier Brouillette is banged up. It seems like Collins is a little bit of the deep route guy for the Rough Riders. There was one against Ottawa. It actually happened right in front of me on the field where both Roosevelt and Collins were on the same position. They must have ran the same route, it seemed like. But as far as the Rough Riders go, they'll use Collins as a downfield threat. You could see that against Johnson as they try to go after Brouillette. John Childs, whether it's him or Ryan Langford at the weak side slot back position, they'll get Billy Parker. That's a bad matchup. Billy Parker has been a very good cover guy at the halfback position. Kenny Shaw, the only reason he had success this past week was all the injuries in the Argos receiving group, so Ricky Ray had no other option but to go to Kenny Shaw. If Childs is banged up and if Langford is in there, I think Billy Parker will win that matchup. Finally, the last couple here, Rob Bagg goes against Chip Cox, and I think that one, a couple of veteran guys. I've talked about how Bagg needs to become a little bit more of the security blanket for Mitchell Gale. I think until that time, he might struggle a little bit with Gale I should just go back and say with Darian Durant, he'll be that security blanket. I think as far as Mitchell Gale goes, he won't quite look to somebody like Rob Bagg. I think Roosevelt is his security blanket because he knows that he's going to be catching those curl route type routes. And so for Bagg against Chip Cox, I don't have high hopes for that. But Bagg could see some targets. And then the last one, whether it's Shamad Chambers or Nick Dembski, depending on if Chambers is ready to go, they'll get Ethan Davis. And nobody has really challenged Davis that much. If you look at the target numbers at that position, teams are, for the most part, staying to the weak side of the field and attacking that side with the Alouettes. So Ethan Davis against Shamad Chambers or Nick Dembski, there won't be a ton there. Dembski's points could come from the return game. Lastly, Curtis Steele, the running back for the Rough Riders, whether or not he's healthy, we talked about that in the injury segment, or if it is Michael Dyer that comes in and gets the start. The Alouettes defense are going to be quite tired. They only have 3 days in between games, and that could affect those defensive players as well. If you start to see something that indicates maybe you do want to take a flyer on one of the lower salaried players with the Rough Riders, there is potential there because the Alouettes are coming off a short week here. So Curtis Steele, Bearwoods was banged up already coming into the week. He's a warrior. I know you said to me at halftime, you sent me a text. He looks like a football player through and through. Those eyes, you see the intensity from Bearwoods.
Watching that interview, I'm like, are you human? If there, you look up focus in the dictionary, that was Bearwoods playing it. You wouldn't even look at, I believe it was Shinetti that was doing it. You wouldn't even look at him. He was so focused, and like an animal, that guy. Bearwoods is a scary guy, and to add into that Arian Laverius found himself quite often in the backfield, as does Gabriel Napton quite often, and that's something to be aware of, that a very active Montreal defense, but like you said, a very short rest could be a big one, which would be a reason why Kevin Glenn, I would think, probably could make a few poor decisions in the game coming up this weekend. Kevin Glenn, also known to throw a pick, as we've never shied away from on our Twitter account, and even in our fantasy guide, that Glenn quite often does throw a ball into coverage where you're looking, where was that going? And he may be a guy that could be heavily frustrated by some of these matchups against the Riders secondary.
Yeah, you start with that first one. Last week, Chris Williams, only one catch of 14 yards off of 4 targets against Buddy Jackson. Well, Jackson goes against Deron Carter this week, and Jackson, I think, was even a little bit banged up. You had talked about that he did miss some action, but it seemed after the game I saw him walking off the field, looked like he was walking just fine and not going to be missing out on any action. He let Williams know every time he didn't catch the ball, he was in his ear. Buddy Jackson is a veteran of the Calgary Stampeders defense for the last number of years. Now he comes to Saskatchewan and Chris Jones's defense. He's going to be getting Deron Carter. That's going to be a fun matchup to watch. But really,
for many reasons,
especially when you consider Buddy Jackson a very physical defensive back, he's going to be in Carter's face trying to get under his skin. I could see Duron Carter get frustrated, especially if the Alouettes aren't putting any points on the board. Who knows with his issues that he's had this season already.
Duron Carter may take Buddy Jackson and just body slam him or demolition style. Have someone go off the top rope and elbow him in the head. I don't know. Duron Carter to me is, mentally. He's a player, right? He gets focused, he gets jacked up, and he gets in the game. All right. Speaking of the opposite of that, Nick Lewis, not really a mouthpiece on the field. He's a fun guy to watch, mouthpiece off the field, a guy that got fined for some of the words that he said and kind of get his team in the game. Well, now he's got Otha Foster likely matched up and a pretty good coverage there. Brad Sinopoli saw Otha Foster last week, Nick Moore the week before, Corey Watson the week before. And Nick Lewis, as we mentioned earlier on, probably not going to get a lot of yards or a lot of points, only mainly because of the game and Kevin Glenn's inability to move the ball around. Hey, let's face it. After, the first half? Glenn only had 80 yards in passing. He only hit Lewis and Carter. Those are the only targets. BJ Cunningham is this next guy. He saw his first catch in the last game at 1:05 into the fourth quarter. So Kevin Glenn is going to lock in, and he's not going to have a lot of success against this Riders defense.
Yeah, his targets are going down. He gets Ed Gainey this week, who teams have targeted, but they haven't had a whole lot of success against. Last week, Ernest Jackson, 5 catches on 7 targets. The week before, Emmanuel Arsenault, 6 catches on 15 targets. And the week prior to that, Adarius Bowman, 6 catches on 9 targets against Ed Gainey. I know that you've been down on Gainey, but he is, if he could catch a football, he would be one of the top defensive backs in the league. But as far as coverage goes, he's done very well against some top receivers. And I could see Kevin Glenn just looking at this and going, well, I better stay away from him. And continued to not use BJ Cunningham the way Rakeem Cato did in the week that he was in at quarterback.
As we predicted, we kind of talked about that. So BJ Cunningham in weeks going forward, unless they give the keys to Vernon Adams, which I think, is it fair to say, in the prediction category, something we might be looking at going forward, depending on if Jim Pop still has a job. There's likely going to be some sort of shuffle in there somewhere. And Justin Cox is a guy that has had himself a really actually respectable season this year coming in, and he had Nate Kuhorn a couple weeks back, made some good plays against him, against the Eskimos. Sam Jaguar doesn't get those feature primary guys, but when balls go the way of the second-tier receivers, he's going to make plays. He's going to attack the football. He's going to force you to make a tough catch. Sam Jaguar, as it is, rarely gets targeted in a football game at all, maybe on a screen pass, maybe on an end around, and Justin Cox likely is going to prevent that continually going forward, especially into this game.
Yeah, I agree on that one. And Jaguar, some added value as he's made his way onto the return game for the Alouettes, but again, really not much into the Kevin Glenn offense. And then the fifth receiver in that group, Corbin Lokes. We've talked about him on past podcasts, the potential that is there, but there is also the potential that maybe the Alouettes go with a different face in there. They have Marcus Henry, they have Jacoby Ford on the practice roster. As far as the Rough Riders go, it'll be a new face in that strong side halfback position as Brandon McDonald was released. The possibility is there, Darius Brooks could come off the 6-game injured list early and be in that position. Another one that's a possibility is Johnny Dixon. And what I think would happen there is Dixon would go to the corner and Justin Cox would shift inside to the halfback. Possibilities there, but watch for the depth chart once that comes out. Finally, Brandon Rutley, we've covered that already. Rutley's going to have some success against the Rough Riders as a somewhat cheaper option on DraftKings. And as like you said, whether or not Jim Pop is going to use him, I think he will. You don't quite agree with me on that.
I totally agree with you. I just didn't want to be waving my Brandon Rutley fangirl flag continually through this podcast. We were like, "You're in love with Brandon Rutley, aren't you?" Tweeting him on Twitter there. But yeah, Brandon Rutley, he was a keeper in my long format fantasy football league, and people were like, "Why are you keeping Brandon Rutley? He's a backup." I'm like, I'll tell you why I'm keeping Brandon Rutley, and now nobody's curious. All right, back half of the doubleheader, BC Calgary on Friday night, and here is a game. If you subscribe to our DFS rankings, we may see this one differently than the average football fan. John Jennings, did he ever explode before the bye week? And he had some success against Calgary earlier on the season, too.
248 yards through the air in the opening week against Calgary. And then, like you said, prior to the bye week, 429 yards against the Rough Riders. What is now showing a pretty good defense for the Rough Riders. He was able to find his way on some key routes to pick his way through that defense. Starting right with the main target, the main guy, the Manny Show, Emmanuel Arsenault. He had 7 catches on 9 targets for 78 yards in week 1 against Calgary. If you have one of your, $8, $9, $10,000 salaried player on DraftKings producing that type of numbers, you're going to be happy with him. Arsenault, if he throws in a touchdown on that, you're going to be happy with that. This week he gets Jamar Wall, who he was against in that opening week. I like Arsenault in that matchup. Brian Burnham, Dave, you can jump back on this one. 88 yards against the Stamps in week 1, 5 catches on 8 targets. He's going to go against Joe Burnett.
And Joe Burnett's a guy who's prone to picking off passes and jumping routes. Brian Burnham's a physical player. He can absorb hits, he can absorb body contact, and he comes down with the ball. Brian Burnham's going to fight through this matchup, and he's going to catch some balls. Joe Burnett, it doesn't matter how physical he's going to be on Brian Burnham. It's just plain and simple. Burnham's going to come down some yards, and obviously, because we mentioned earlier in the show, Nick Moore gone for the season, those targets now go to Burnham. Brian Burnham's a guy last year, as through the Lule system and as Jennings emerged through, Burnham got more balls. Burnham will continually see more targets, and he's going to fight through Joe Burnett in this matchup this week. And Sean Gore is a guy, he's been hit a lot throughout his career. It's actually kind of funny. It's one of those lesser talked about things and you kind of snicker of. Sean Gore, you can Google and YouTube a lot of his highlights. He gets smoked hard at least once every year, and he comes right back up. But he's matched up against Fred Bennett, likely out of action this weekend from what it looks like. And Keontae Evans was a guy who would jump in there. And Gore's targets could go down this week, too.
And that's an interesting matchup to watch. I think the Stampeders haven't been happy with the performance of Fred Bennett, and we tweeted out on Tuesday afternoon, once that word came out about the Keontae Evans and Fred Bennett were splitting snaps, we had said prior to the season, the Stampeders, I believe it was 3 of 5, wasn't it, Dave? Either 3 of 5 or 4 of 5 of their defensive backs coming to training camp were over the age of 30. So we knew something had to give. They traded Brandon McDonald prior to the season. Now you see Fred Bennett in a real battle for his job. Brandon Smith has been in and out of the lineup with different injuries in games. So Brandon Smith hasn't been, although when he is in, he's one of the primary defensive backs in the CFL. He's been struggling for health to stay in the lineup. Those 3 guys, it seems so predictable. We called them the over the hill gang, and you're starting to see that where there is that transition a little bit away from the older guys.
Marco Iannuzzi is going to be matched up against Tommy Campbell, and Tommy Campbell got targeted. Scott Mitchell of the Calgary Herald tweeted out this week that Tommy Campbell got targeted 11 times last week, and he's making plays. Iannuzzi is a receiver in that secondary that likely he's just there. He's not going to make a lot of plays. The strong side wide receiver, Tommy Campbell, is going to get and make a lot of plays, so that's a tough matchup for Mr. Iannuzzi. And running backs? We talked about before, your guess is as good as ours. Running back, could be Allen, it could be Jeremiah Johnson. Not really sure which one who is going to be good to go, but either way you go.
I know who it's not going to be. It's not going to be Shaquille Murray Lawrence.
So, some other words of advice you may have received over past weeks was people loading up on a Shaquille Murray Lawrence because of his salary on DraftKings. It will not be Shaquille Murray Lawrence. That we can guarantee. Telling you right now, plain and simple. On the Calgary side of the ball, this, I would say, out of any matchup this weekend, out of all of the 4 games, is one we are probably the most excited over. Marquay McDaniel going up against Lucius Purifoy. I can't say that name enough.
Yeah, you saw that matchup in week 1. And McDaniel only had 3 targets. He had 2 catches for 20 yards. Since week 1, he's been the primary receiver for Bo Levi Mitchell. it's going to be interesting because he has been their primary receiver. Was it the matchup in week 1? Was it just how the Stampeders wanted to attack the Lions' defense? Obviously, the Lions came away with the win in week 1. If McDaniel is to have a big day, I think Purifoy is going to be right there with him. I think if he's targeted a lot, you could see Purifoy jump in front of one. That's going to be a fun matchup to watch.
Exciting one. Stephen Clark versus Bakari Grant or Kamar Jordan, as we've mentioned in a couple weeks past. Those two are going to continually fight week in and week out to see who gets that job, to see who comes in line. Kamar Jordan, I make no qualms about it. Player coming into the season I predicted big things from, and we might see him coming back in as Bakari Grant got the last couple of weeks. Granted, his success last week was against the Bombers defense, and Bakari did come out and kind of give it to Bo Levi Mitchell a little bit that he wasn't seeing a lot of targets. So maybe Kamar Jordan comes back in the lineup, a younger and a bigger threat. I always figure Bakari Grant by looking at him, he's like 39 years old. Bakari Grant, still south of 30. Blows my mind looking at that guy.
He has the long sleeves now, and for those that follow the NFL, there was James Jones of the Green Bay Packers, always wore the hoodie. Now you have Bakari Grant that always wears the long sleeves, regardless of if it's snowing or if it's the hottest day of the year. He's going to be in long sleeves.
Oh boy. Stephen Clark, as you mentioned earlier, TJ Lee coming out, Clark will come in. And oh boy, here comes our favorite segment of the podcast. Yell.
This week, Greg Wilson goes on Yell Hell against Ronnie Yell. Don't like him in that matchup. You look back at week 1, Joe West only had 3 catches for 16 yards. Wilson didn't do much against the Bombers. I can't see him doing a whole lot this week. Ronnie Yell will probably eliminate him from the Calgary offense.
Lamar Durant goes up against Ryan Phillips. The good news is this Durant against Phillips isn't Darian. Bo Levi Mitchell is not afraid of Ryan Phillips, so likely going to see a few targets going that way. That's an exciting matchup, an underrated matchup. Ryan Phillips, a longtime veteran. His CFL Ironman was at one point in time, and that's going to be a fun one to watch. There'll be some challenging plays. Durant's going to have to fight for some balls. Don't expect a whole lot of success on that matchup, but Durant definitely will fight for some catches. You
can see him maybe going deep on Phillips as Durant has that speed to stretch a defense. And I think as far as his ankle goes, it should be back to health. Going back to the other Durant, Darian Durant, as far as his ankle, we had said that he's probably going to take his extra week off against the Montreal defense and allow Gale another week. Durant probably could have been in the lineup for the Stampeders last week, but they're playing Winnipeg. They probably just said, take another week, get it back to 100%. So don't worry about whether or not he's at 100%. They gave him an extra week, in my mind, to get back into the lineup.
Anthony Parker, we already had a couple questions on Twitter over this, and a guy that Dan and I talked about right after the game. We, as soon as Parker caught that touchdown, we even said, oh boy, people are going to lose their minds over how Parker's salary is going to go up, and they're wondering if there's great value for who he is. Again, Anthony Parker, we talked about him early on. Brandon Stewart is a pretty good covering strong side and cornerback. Brandon Stewart's a guy that's come in and out of the lineup, played on 4 teams now in the CFL in his career, and it's going to be a matchup that Anthony Parker's not going to have a whole lot of success going up against the veteran.
Week 1, it was 2 catches on 3 targets for 26 yards, and then the last one for the Stampeders is Jerome Messam. BC, with Mikhail Brooks back in, is the top defense against the run on a per-game basis. Without Brooks, they gave up a lot against Toronto in that game. We talked about it on last week's podcast, how important Mikhail Brooks is for that BC Lions defense, and with him in the lineup against Calgary here, I can't see Messam doing a whole lot.
All right, looking at the final matchup for the weekend. Sunday at 5:30, Toronto and Ottawa. Right before the Argos go on bye week, Logan Kilgore is going to make his first start against an Ottawa Red Blacks defense that is going to be in his hip pocket, in his back pocket, in his face all night long. And Vidal Hazelton, well, he may have himself quite the matchup if he's healthy and playing
this
on the weekend.
This could be a key matchup if Hazelton is going, and if the Ottawa Red Blacks do what I think they're going to do, and that's put Mitchell White at the the boundary corner and the weak side against Hazelton. If not, you could see Kenny Shaw probably shift to the outside. The other possibility is Wallace Miles into that position. But for the Red Blacks, they're likely to go with that. Last week we talked about the combination of Kane, Tristan Jackson, and Jarrell Gavins. On the strong side of the field, last week it was Mitchell White, but in past weeks I could see them going back to Forrest Hightower, who had been there in the previous weeks for the Ottawa Red Blacks. Torrey Gurley obviously is the incumbent on that strong side. He was only on the one game again this week. As far as the injury list, it's not a long-term injury with Gurley. They haven't put him on the 6th game or anything, so there is a possibility that Gurley could come back and he would match up against Hightower or Mitchell White. Devin Wiley was the one that filled in for Gurley. It's a possibility that he could stay in the lineup either there at one of the strong side slot back positions, at the weak side slot back, where Kenny Shaw normally lines up. Like
linebacker, offensive lineman, running back.
Yeah,
he can play
if Kenny Shaw, if Hazelton cannot go, like we said, it's strong possibility that Shaw would shift to the outside receiver spot, and you could maybe see Phil Bates go there, Devin Wiley go there. They would probably get Abdul Kane. Kane probably will follow Shaw wherever he goes. He played the corner last week, so there's a possibility there that Kenny Shaw could see a lot of Abdul Kane. And last week, that was where Jarrell Gavins lined up. It's a confusing one here, but Phil Bates lined up on the strong side slot back. You could see him against Gavins. I think that would be the most likely one. Forrest Hightower played there last week. Devin Wiley could go there. And that's, really the one that is not really a big factor. Phil Bates only had 1 catch for 1 yard last time against the Red Blacks. Going back to Kenny Shaw, 11 targets, 7 catches, and 94 yards last time out against Ottawa. And then finally, the sort of split back position for the Argos. You had Anthony Coombs and Andre Dury splitting duties there. Antoine Pruneau would be in coverage there. Dury had 2 catches for 17 yards the last time against the men in flannel. I think that one isn't a very high one in my mind, but as we've said, Coombs is getting moved around a little bit on the offense. Last one being Brandon Whitaker. Ottawa, stout against the run. Can't see Whitaker doing a whole lot.
The big matchup that we're actually not really talking about because it's really hard to actually make any money on DraftKings on this. The Ottawa Red Blacks versus the referees. The Red Blacks are the most penalized team in the CFL, and the Toronto Argos, if there's a stat for it, have probably scored the most touchdowns off of penalties in the CFL this season. And Abdul Kane, what does he like to do? Take penalties. He's a good cover, a good aggressive defensive back, so keep that in mind. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, Ricky Ray is going to spread the ball around to 7-8 receivers. Logan Kilgore, probably not going to do that. He's going to pick 1 favorite, 2 favorites, and he's going to rely on those guys. But as the game wears on, the Argos are going to be tired. They're heading in a bye week. Probably going to get a little bit out of hand. But yeah, that's your guess is as good as ours. And guess what? Yay, the depth chart's not going to come out until Saturday. So you're not going to know any of that until Saturday.
And one other thing, just as far as the point goes with that, we saw as far as with Gurley's injury, we didn't know 2 weeks ago whether Gurley was going to be in. We didn't know last week whether Gurley was going to be in. That's going to be the same thing with Hazelton this week and with Gurley as well on who is going to be in or out of the lineup. We're lucky that we know Ricky Ray is out of the lineup. The problem with it, not a whole lot of media coverage of the Toronto Argonauts, not many beat writers. You look in Saskatchewan, you've got guys climbing on each other's backs to get a microphone into an interview session. Trainers or janitors. Yeah, like a whole lot of coverage of teams like Saskatchewan, Edmonton, and Winnipeg. But as far as the Toronto Argonauts go, very little coverage, and it's really tough for us to give you more information when we're not getting a whole lot of information out of Toronto.
Well, information is going to come out on Wednesday about Trevor Harris, Henry Burris, or Brock Jensen. Which one's going to be the quarterback? We talked about that earlier on already. Chris Williams, the weak side wide receiver, is going to likely on depth chart place up against the weak side cornerback position. That is A.J. Jefferson. Williams had 6 catches on 7 targets for 63 yards in week number 4. A.J. Jefferson did blow a tire in that game against the Alouettes, which did lead to the Duron Carter touchdown. If not for that, Duron Carter wasn't overly successful in that matchup. A.J. Jefferson's a ball hawk. A.J. Jefferson is a good defensive player. But Chris Williams now has had a couple of games in a row where he doesn't produce Chris Williams numbers. So the big statistic, the big thing to watch for is who's going to be quarterback. Is it Harris or Burris? Clearly, Williams is going to get a lot of targets. If it's Brock Jensen, maybe he's been practicing throwing to Williams a little more this week because likely never got a part of the first-team offense before. So that's going to be a matchup to watch for this week. Greg Ellingson, strong side slot back position, gets matched up against Devin Smith. Strong side halfback, Ellingson was the big man a couple of weeks ago, 218 yards. Devin Smith now going to be starting in that position. Smith is a good, aggressive player. And again, all that relies on the quarterback position. Keon Raymond and Brad Sinopoli is probably the most intriguing matchup in this entire list here. Sinopoli, not a very exciting week. 3 catches for 21 yards against week 4 against Toronto. Keon Raymond, personal friend of mine and a long-time player in the CFL, a veteran cover guy, converted from defensive back to linebacker because he wanted to be around the ball more. He wanted to make plays. Brad Sinopoli is going to be a guy. He's going to be in his hip pocket. And TJ Heath against Ernest Jackson, the weak side halfback position. Heath had himself an interception last week, running down the eyes of Kevin Glenn. Jackson 6 for 6, 70 yards, 6 catches on 6 targets in week number 4. And Jackson likely not going to see a whole lot of production again until Burris or the Harris is in the lineup, likely more of Burris. And round it all out before we get to the running back spot. Jake Hardy against Aaron Berry. Hardy pretty pedestrian a couple weeks ago against Toronto. The strong side wide receiver against a strong side cornerback. Mr. Nick Grigsby. Oh, why don't we end it there? We talked about him already at length before. And Grigsby, well, we'll probably see a pretty successful week out of that guy. Longest podcast so far in history. Round of applause for ourselves. I know you've enjoyed it. A lot of information there. Some good fantasy football information. Thanks so much, man. We love the DFS stuff. We love the DraftKings. We're so glad to have all these new listeners in the States. Any final thoughts from the quarterback of the stats, Mr. Dan, the stats guy?
I think my biggest thing I'm going to be continuing to watch for is some of the running back positions, because you said the BC situation, Jeremiah Johnson and Anthony Allen. You've talked about Curtis Steele, whether he's going to be healthy. You've also got the situation in Ottawa in terms of Nick Grigsby and Trayvon Van coming back. And then finally in Montreal, Brandon Rutley is getting the carries now, but the possibility with Tyrell Sutton coming back from injury in a few weeks. It's going to be interesting to see. We saw some more production out of the running backs this week, and I think if you look back on historical CFL statistics, it takes a few weeks for the running backs to get going. You don't see generally big games until later on in the season, once the sort of the blocking schemes and the teams start to gel as a unit on offense. That's when the running games start going. You haven't seen many 100-plus yard games. I think you're going to start seeing the offenses start getting the running backs going, and the possibility of some real sleepers to get you some flexibility with your lineup if you're able to start one of those cheaper options.
All right, go get some flexibility. Hey, maybe you've been running, maybe you've been driving, maybe you're sitting down having a beer. Whatever you're doing, we're so thankful that you listen to this show, and you do each and every week. Episode 11 is in the books. Thanks to producer Dan, who wasn't able to be in action tonight, and to engineer Ben, who also was missing on probably the one game. Hopefully not the 6th game. Hopefully those guys will be back in action next week. Hey, you can follow us on Twitter at CFL Fantasy FTB. Follow Dan on Twitter at Dan_UK1. I'm at Dave Dawson 7. And all the mediums that you can follow us as well: Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, you name it. We're everywhere. Lower Your Weapons by Revolution Engine will end it for us again this week. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.